She stood in a federal courtroom in Helena, Montana, and she did not flinch. The lawyer called her unstable, fragile, confused. She had ridden 300 miles through a mountain pass with two cracked ribs and a rifle she'd learned to fire 2 months before. She had survived an attack that killed 8 people. She had carried the evidence of 22 stolen years across open country that wanted her dead, and she had arrived. This is how she got there. She stood in a federal courtroom in Helena, Montana on a Tuesday morning in late September, and she did not flinch. The lawyer across from her was expensive. His suit said Boston. His posture said certainty. He had spent the better part of an hour suggesting in careful legal language that the woman seated before the jury was not to be trusted, that she was fragile, that she was confused, that the documents she had carried across more than 1,000 miles of open country were stolen property, not evidence, that the story she was telling was not the truth but the invention of a mind that had long since lost its footing. He said the word unstable the way men like him always said it, gently, regretfully, as if it pained him to say it at all. Eleanor Voss looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She simply waited until he finished, and then she stood up without being asked, and she spoke. The courtroom went quiet. But to understand how a woman who had arrived in Montana with nothing but a leather satchel and a heartbeat came to stand in that courtroom and say what she said, we have to go back. Back to the morning Cole Hargrove rode out into the July heat and found the wagons burning. Back to the moment he pressed his ear against a stranger's chest and heard something so faint it was barely worth calling a sound. A heartbeat. Half a heartbeat. Enough. This is the story of a woman who was handed over by her father's debt, imprisoned inside a marriage for 22 years, and left for dead on a Montana trail. In the next 2 hours, you will watch her go from a woman lying in the dirt with blood in her hair to a woman standing in a federal courtroom telling the most powerful man she had ever known that he did not own her, that he never had. But she did not get there alone. And the man who rode beside her is the reason we begin where we do on a sun-cracked stretch of the Bozeman Trail on a July morning that smelled of sage and something worse when Cole Hargrove saw the smoke. Cole Hargrove was 46 years old and had no particular reason to keep going. That is not quite the same as wanting to stop. He understood the difference. He was not the kind of man who entertained dark thoughts on the porch at night. He was the kind of man who simply went through the motions of a life because the motions were still there, still waiting to be completed even after the reason for them was gone. You fed the horses, you mended the fence, you boiled the coffee and poured 1 cup instead of 2 and stood at the window long enough to feel the cold of the glass before you turned away. 3 years. That was how long it had been since Della. Della Hargrove had died in early August, the summer before last, taken by a fever that started on a Tuesday and finished its work by the following Wednesday. 9 days. Cole had sat beside her bed for all 9 of them, and he had been holding her hand when the breathing stopped. He had carried her out himself, laid her beneath the cottonwood tree on the ridge where the shade fell long in the afternoon and the view stretched west past the hills into open country that seemed to go on forever. He had built the fence around that spot himself, post by post, in the weeks after, when building was the only thing that kept his hands from shaking. Since then, he had lived alone on 40 acres 5 miles west of the Bozeman Trail. His cabin sat against the shoulder of a low hill. 1 room, a side room, a porch that faced west. He kept 2 horses, a dozen cattle, and a routine so fixed it required no thought. Up before dawn. Coffee. Feed the animals. Ride the fence line. Come back. Eat something. Sit on the porch until the light died. Sleep. Begin again. He wore the same thing most days. A blue work shirt faded at the elbows, the color of sky in early morning before the heat got into it. A brown leather vest that had gone soft with use, the color of dark earth after rain. Della had bought him that vest the second winter they were together. She had pressed her palm flat against his chest after he put it on and said, "That's the one." He had never bought another. On the morning this story begins, he was 2 miles east of home on horseback when he saw the smoke. It rose in columns, not wisps. 3, maybe 4 distinct sources climbing against the pale morning sky. Cole pulled his mare to a stop and squinted through the heat haze. July had turned the trail into something punishing. The dust was so fine it coated your teeth. The air sat on your chest like a hand pressing down and not letting go. But smoke in open country meant trouble, And trouble out here did not wait for you to be ready. He clicked his tongue. The mare moved forward. Her ears went flat. Easy, he murmured. Easy, girl. He pulled the rifle from the scabbard and held it low as they approached. Not aimed, just ready. The difference between those two things was a second and a half, and a second and a half was enough if you knew what you were doing. The smell hit him 50 yards out, burnt canvas and gunpowder, and something underneath that he did not want to name. He dismounted, tied the mare to a scrub branch, and moved on foot through the wreckage. 4 wagons, all burning or burned, goods scattered across the dirt bolts of cloth, a cast iron skillet, a child's boot lying alone near the wheel rut. Cole stopped when he saw the boot, looked away, kept moving. The first body was face down near the trail's edge. A man, middle-aged, hat still on shot in the back. Cole did not touch him. The second was a woman near the lead wagon, arms wide dress torn at the shoulder. The third was slumped against a smoldering wheelhead, bowed as if he had simply fallen asleep in an inconvenient place. Cole counted 8 before he stopped counting. He had seen death before. He had buried his own wife with dirt still under his fingernails. But this was different. This was deliberate. The goods were still here. Nothing of value had been taken. Whoever had done this had not come to rob. They had come to kill. And they had done it thoroughly, and they had left, and the sun was already burning the evidence into the earth like a brand pressed into hide. He moved through the wreckage slowly, checking each body the way a man checks fence posts after a storm, not hoping to find something standing, just doing the work because someone had to. Then he heard it, a sound so small it could have been wind moving through broken wood. A breath, not even a full breath. The half-second intake of someone who was still fighting to stay. Cole froze. He turned his head. Behind the rear wagon, tucked between a shattered wheel and a trunk that had been split open by fire, something moved. Fabric. The curl of a hand. He dropped to one knee. A woman lay on her side, face pressed into the dirt, blood matted dark in her hair. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. It was a fine dress, too fine for a settler's wagon, the kind of fabric that came from a city, not a dry goods store. One hand was pressed flat against the ground. The other was curled around the strap of a leather satchel held so tight the knuckles had gone white even in unconsciousness. Cole set his rifle down in the dirt. He reached out slowly. "Ma'am, nothing. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her fingers moved. A low sound came from somewhere deep in her throat. Not a word. Just pain trying to find a shape, trying to become something that another person might understand. He slid one hand beneath her head. Careful. Slow. He tilted her face toward him. The bruise along her jaw was the color of a storm cloud, dark and spreading. Her lip was split. There was a gash above her left ear, deep and ugly, still seeping. But her eyes moved behind closed lids, fighting to open, still in there, still somewhere behind all of it, still present. "You're alive," Cole said, mostly to himself. "Lord Almighty, you're alive." He checked for broken bones the way a man checks such things methodically without fuss. Her ribs made her wince when he pressed gently on the left side. Cracked, maybe. Not broken through. The head wound needed cleaning and closing. Her hands were scraped raw, both of them, the kind of damage that comes from dragging yourself across gravel in the dark. She had been conscious at some point after the attack. She had moved. She had crawled into hiding and stayed there. She had survived this on her own before he ever arrived. He lifted her. She weighed less than he expected, as if the ordeal had already taken something from her that couldn't be measured in pounds. Her head fell against his chest, and for a moment her grip loosened on the satchel. He caught it before it fell, tucked it close against her. His mare snorted when he mounted with the woman across the saddle. But the old horse didn't fight. She knew the way home. She always did. The cabin was cool inside the log walls, keeping the July heat at bay. Cole laid the woman on the cot in the side room, lit the lamp, and went to work. He cleaned the wound above her ear with water and a torn shirt, pressed until the blood ran clear, wrapped her head with a strip of clean linen, bandaged her hands, pulled a wool blanket up to her chin despite the heat because the body in shock does not know what season it is and does not care to be reminded. Then he sat in the chair by the door and waited. He was good at waiting. 3 years had made him expert at the particular stillness required to simply sit inside a difficulty without trying to resolve it before it was ready. She slept through the rest of that day and through the night. Cole did not. He sat and watched her breathe, counted the rise and fall of her chest the way he used to count fence posts on a long ride, steady patient, making sure nothing was missing. Night came in slow, the way it does in summer when the sun doesn't want to quit. Crickets started their racket somewhere in the grass beyond the barn. A coyote threw a long, thin cry at the dark and got no answer. The lamp burned low. Cole refilled it and went back to the chair. She woke just past dawn. He heard the change in her breathing first. A hitch, then a sharp intake, the kind that comes when a body remembers danger before the mind catches up. He was on his feet before her eyes opened. They opened wide, gray-edged with green, full of the particular terror that belongs to people who have survived something they did not expect to survive and have not yet processed that the surviving is real. She tried to sit up. Her ribs stopped her immediately, hard and certain. She grabbed at them with both hands, gasping. "Don't move," Cole said. He kept his hands where she could see them, palms open, still. "You're hurt. You're safe. I'm not going to touch you." Her eyes moved around the room. The log walls, the single window, the lamp still burning, his rifle in the corner. "Where?" Her voice came out cracked and dry as old wood. "My cabin, 5 miles west of the Bozeman Trail." "The wagons." "Gone, ma'am. All of them." Something collapsed behind her eyes, not tears, something deeper than tears. The kind of breaking that happens so far down it doesn't make a sound and leaves no mark on the surface. She turned her face to the wall. Cole stood there a moment, then he stepped back. "There's water on the table when you're ready," he said. "Broth on the stove, I'll be outside." He pulled the door halfway shut behind him and walked to the porch. The morning air hit his face like something clean. He gripped the porch rail and stood there. His hands were shaking. He had not noticed until now, had not noticed the cost of the last several hours until the urgency was past and the body reported back on what it had been through. 3 years of silence, 3 years of a house so quiet you could hear the woods settling in the cold. And now there was a stranger in the side room with blood in her hair and eyes that looked like they had watched the floor drop out from under the whole world. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she had come from or why she had been on that trail. But he knew one thing, sure as he knew the direction of west. He was not going to let her die. She didn't speak for 2 days. Cole didn't push. He brought broth the first morning, cornbread the second evening, left them on the table beside the cot, and walked back out. Sometimes he heard her eating. Sometimes the bowl sat untouched when he came back. He didn't remark on it either way. Some people needed feeding. Some people needed silence. She apparently needed both. On the morning of the third day, he was on the porch mending a bridle when the cabin door opened behind him. She stood in the frame. She had wrapped herself in the wool blanket. Despite the July heat, her body still making decisions independent of the season. Her face was pale. The bruising on her jaw had darkened overnight to a deep purple black. Her jaw was set in a way that told him she had been working herself up to this for some time. She gripped the doorframe with one hand and looked at him. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was stronger now, still careful. Every word measured out like she was counting what she had and didn't want to spend more than necessary. "Go ahead. Why did you bring me here? Because you were alive. That's not a reason. It's the only one I got." She studied him. He could feel it the way you feel a weight placed on something not unpleasant, just present. She looked at him like she was reading a contract, searching for the clause that would cost her something. "You could have ridden to the nearest town. Sent someone else. Could have. Then why didn't you?" He met her eyes, held them without looking away. "Because the last time someone I cared about needed help, I wasn't fast enough. And I've had 3 years to sit with that." Something shifted in her face. The suspicion didn't leave. But it moved aside, made room for something else, a kind of recognition. The look of someone who understands what it means to carry a failure that doesn't get lighter no matter how long you carry it. She lowered herself onto the top porch step, slow and careful. One hand pressed against her left side. The blanket pooled around her like still water. Neither of them spoke for a while. The morning went about its business around them. "Then Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Voss. People used to call me Ellie. I haven't been Ellie in a long time." Cole set the bridle down and gave his hands something to do with a loose piece of leather. "Cole Hargrove." He kept his eyes on the work. "You can be whatever name suits you. Makes no difference to me." She almost smiled. Almost it got as far as the corners of her mouth and stopped there. You live out here alone. I do. By choice, by what's left after choice runs out. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the blanket. Your wife. Cole's hand stilled. She had seen the second cup on the shelf, the dress still folded in the back room. People who live alone long enough either put those things away or leave them exactly as they are, and both options say something about the person. He had done neither deliberately. He had simply left everything where it was because moving it would have required a decision he hadn't been ready to make. Della, he said, 3 years ago, summer fever took her in 9 days. I'm sorry, I appreciate that. He went back to the leather. I had a husband too, she said. The word had landed like something thrown down rather than set. He isn't dead. I wish he were, but he isn't. Cole didn't flinch, didn't adjust his expression, just kept his hands moving and listened. Arthur Voss, she said. Boston. He owns 2 banks and enough judges to paper a courtroom wall. She said it the way you recite something you've said so many times it stopped hurting and started simply being fact you carry rather than feel. I married him when I was 22 because my father owed him money. When my father died, Arthur got everything. The house, the accounts, me. The crickets fell quiet in the heat. My father, his name was Amos Britton, built everything he had from a single loom in a rented room in Lowell, Massachusetts. 40 years of honest work. Arthur took it in one afternoon with a pen and a crooked judge and a signature that was not my father's. She stopped, looked at her hands, at the scrapes still visible across the knuckles. 6 months ago, I found the papers. In Arthur's study in a box he kept locked and considered too secure to worry about. The original will forged. Bank transfer records, letters between Arthur and the probate judge, proof of every cent that was taken and where it went. I packed one bag. I got on a wagon train, heading west under a name that wasn't mine. Cole looked at the satchel she'd brought out with her. She'd kept it close even here on a porch 5 miles from anywhere. The satchel, he said quietly. Her head came up fast. You looked inside it, no ma'am, but you held on to it like it was the last thing keeping you breathing. Figured it mattered. She watched him for a long moment. Her chest rose and fell with the careful, deliberate breath of someone whose ribs were teaching her not to move too quickly. Those papers are the only proof of what Arthur did. If I lose them, I lose everything. And Arthur knows I have them. She paused. He knows I got on that wagon train. He knows what I was carrying. Cole set the bridle down entirely. He looked out at the trail, the long, empty stretch of dust that led east toward a world he had left behind 3 years ago and had not missed. The attack, he said. Not a question. I know he ordered it. She said it without a tremor in her voice. Arthur doesn't leave loose ends. He'll send more men. He'll have already sent them. He will not stop until those papers are back in his possession and I am somewhere I can no longer speak to anyone who matters. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have you been trying to get away from him? She was quiet too, the kind of quiet that holds more than one answer and isn't sure which one to offer. The first time was 7 years ago, she said finally. I found a lawyer in Cambridge, a man named Prescott. Honest man, good reputation. I told him what Arthur had done. She stopped. Within a month, Prescott's license was revoked. The Bar Association found irregularities in cases going back years, cases that had no irregularities when I spoke to him. Arthur has connections to the bar, to the courts, to the men who run the courts. She turned and looked directly at Cole. He doesn't just have money, he has systems. And the man he sent after me, Marcus Crane, is not just a lawyer, he's a hunter. He finds women who run and brings them back. He has done it before, for other men like Arthur. Cole absorbed this the way he absorbed most difficult information, quietly without reaction, letting it settle before deciding what to do with it. There's something else, Ellie said. Her voice dropped half a note. 7 years ago, when I tried to run the first time, Arthur had 3 doctors come to the house. They examined me. 2 hours. Then they signed a document saying I was suffering from female hysteria, nervous disposition, unfit for independent decision-making. He told me that if I ever tried again, he had a judge in Helena ready to sign the commitment papers. I'd spend the rest of my life in a sanatorium, and every person I tried to tell my story to would already have that document waiting for them when they asked about me. She said it flatly. The anger in it had been compressed so long, it had gone hard like coal under pressure, still combustible, but no longer loud about it. Cole looked at her. Then we better figure out where we're going, he said. The map was on the table that evening. Cole spread it flat, weighted the corners with a coffee cup and a lamp. Ellie stood across from him and studied it with the focused attention of someone who has learned that the difference between a good plan and a dead end is often a matter of which road you notice first. The nearest town was Stillwater, 8 miles north. Population 30, a saloon, a general store, a church that doubled as a feed store on Wednesdays. If they needed supplies, ammunition, grain provisions for a longer ride, Stillwater was the only option within a reasonable distance. Helena was the problem. The nearest federal courthouse sat 140 miles to the northwest. That was where Ellie needed to go. That was where the papers in the satchel could be entered as evidence in front of a judge with the authority to act on them. But to get there, they needed to move. And before they moved, they needed to know what was already in motion against them. The following morning, Cole and Ellie rode into Stillwater before the heat peaked. Ellie wore his spare hat pulled low. The bruise on her jaw had faded from black to a sick yellow-green, noticeable if you looked, forgettable if you didn't. She held herself the way a person holds themselves when invisibility is a skill they have spent years perfecting, shoulders slightly in chin at a neutral angle, eyes that took in everything without seeming to look at anything. May Whitfield ran the general store. She was 60 years old, built like a cedar post, and had survived 2 husbands, a son, and 30 Montana winters without once losing the ability to look a person in the eye and know what they needed before they said it. She looked at Cole first, then at Ellie. Something quick moved in her eyes, a recognition of some kind, the look of a woman who has seen certain things before and knows them on sight. Morning, Cole. Morning, May. We need ammunition. 44 caliber. Flour salt coffee, dried pork. Got it. She came out from behind the counter and began moving through the shelves with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is and has never needed to look. She kept her voice easy and her eyes on her hands. Anything for the lady? Ellie hesitated for just a moment. Thread. And soap if you have any that doesn't smell like a tannery. May almost smiled. I have something. French milled. Came in on a shipment nobody wanted. Too fancy for most folks around here. I'll take it. May wrapped the bundle without hurrying. Then she leaned across the counter, voice dropping to something quieter than conversation. Cole. A man came through 2 days ago, riding west from Billings direction. Nice horse, nice coat, boots that had seen a lot of use but hadn't started in the dirt. He went to the saloon and asked if anyone had seen a woman traveling alone. Dark hair, medium build, said she was his wife, said she was sick, that she'd wandered off during a family trip and he was trying to bring her home safely. Cole's hand went still on the counter. What did people tell him? Nothing. Nobody'd seen anything. But he left a name at the saloon in case anyone remembered something later. Paid $10 for information. That's a lot of concern for a sick wife. What name? Marcus Crane. Said he was a lawyer out of Boston. Ellie had gone completely still beside him. Cole did not look at her. He kept his eyes on May. May looked at Ellie directly. Her face was unreadable, but her voice carried something underneath it softer than the words, older than the situation. You take care of yourself, honey, whatever your name is. Ellie's throat moved. Thank you. They were out the door and mounted before either of them spoke. He's already in the territory, Ellie said. Her voice was controlled, but tight the way a wire goes tight before it snaps. Cole checked the saddlebags were secure. He's 2 days ahead of us or behind us. Either way, we know. That's better than not knowing. How? Ellie said, tell me how that is better. Because now we prepare instead of guess. She turned away from him and stared down the road. A muscle in her jaw worked. She was doing the arithmetic that people in her situation always do, counting what she had against what she needed, and finding the numbers short in ways that mattered. That evening, Cole spread the map out again. He walked her through the options. Billings was out, the nearest rail station, but also where Crane had ridden from, and a town that size had a telegraph office where descriptions could be sent to every station agent from here to the coast. The main road to Helena was out for the same reason. Stage stops, relay stations, too many eyes available to be bought for $10. That left one route. North through the crazy mountains, then west through the valley toward Fort Ellis. An army outpost. A telegraph line that ran directly to the federal marshal's office in Helena. Rough country, mostly empty. No stage routes, no relay stations. Nobody out there but elk weather and hard ground that asked nothing of you except that you keep moving. 8 days, Cole said. Maybe 10 if the weather turned. Ellie traced the route with her finger, her lips pressed together in concentration. Then she looked up. And if Crane is already asking questions in Stillwater, he'll figure out the direction eventually. He's looking for a woman running, Caird, Cole said. Not a woman going through a mountain pass on horseback in July. He'll be watching the roads, the train stations, the obvious places. Because no woman in her right mind would go that way. That, Cole said, is exactly why it'll work. She looked at him across the table. The lamp caught the silver threaded through her dark hair, the set of her jaw, the bruise fading at the edge of her chin. She looked like someone who had been holding a great weight for a very long time and had finally decided to change her grip before the final push. When do we leave day after tomorrow? You need one more day before you can sit a horse for 8 hours straight. My ribs can manage. Your ribs say different. A beat of silence. Then quietly, Cole. Ma'am, I want to learn to shoot before we go. He looked at her. She was gripping the edge of the table. Not for balance, for something to hold while she said the rest of it. Every day I stay in this cabin without knowing how to protect myself is a day I'm depending on you for something I should be able to do for myself. And I have spent 22 years depending on a man who used that dependence like a leash. She met his eyes with the directness of someone who has arrived at a decision they will not be talked out of. I'm done. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and reached for his hat. We start now, he said. He took her behind the barn where the ground sloped down toward a dry creek bed. He set 5 tin cans on the fence rail. He handed her the Winchester and stepped back. Butt against your shoulder, firm. It's going to kick. I know it kicks. You said you've never held one. I never held one, she said. I didn't say I never watched. He almost smiled. Fair enough. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. There's a difference. Less than it sounds, but it matters. She fired. The rifle drove back into her shoulder, and she stumbled a step, but she didn't drop it. Didn't cry out. The can didn't move. Cole said nothing. She fired again. Wide left. The third shot caught the fence post. The fourth went into the dirt 6 inches from the nearest can. The fifth hit it square and it spun off the rail and clattered down into the creek bed with a small, bright sound. Ellie lowered the rifle. Her hands were trembling. Her shoulder was already going to bruise. How does that feel? Cole asked. She looked at him. For the first time since he had found her in the wreckage of the wagons, there was something in her eyes that was not grief or calculation or the flat, steady numbness of a person just barely surviving. It was something that had been locked away for a long time in a room with no window. It feels like I should have done this 20 years ago. Cole reached down and picked up the fallen can. Set it back on the rail. Again, he said. That night after supper, Cole spread the map out one final time. He had been carrying something all day, a piece of memory he hadn't looked at directly in 3 years. Not forgotten. Just set to one side like a tool you don't need until suddenly the need arrives and you know exactly where you put it. He reached into the drawer beneath the table and pulled out the map he kept separate from the one they'd been using. Older, more worn at the folds. He'd made notes in the margins in his own hand, distances, waypoints, water sources. A route worked out in careful detail over a series of winter evenings by lamplight. He laid it flat on the table. Ellie looked at it, then at the notes in the margins, then up at him. Cole said nothing for a moment. 3 years ago, he said, Della got sick in June, fever that came and went. By July, it was clear she needed a doctor better than the one in Stillwater. I spent 2 weeks charting the route to Helena. Every water source, every place to shelter, every shortcut I could find. He smoothed one corner of the map with his thumb, a small gesture that cost him something. We were going to leave the first week of August. Ellie was very still. She died July 29th, Cole said. He folded the map, set it down. The road I charted goes straight through the crazy mountains and comes out 2 days from Fort Ellis. He looked at her across the table. It's a good route. I know every mile of it on paper. I've just never walked it. Ellie looked at the folded map, at his hands, at his face. Then she said the only thing that needed saying. Then this time you go for someone you got there in time to help. Cole picked up the map, set it in the saddlebag he'd been packing. Get some sleep, he said. We leave before dawn. He walked out to the porch and sat in the rocking chair. The rifle lay across his knees. The stars overhead were thick and very close, the way they only get in open country when there is nothing between you and the sky but your own small life. Somewhere out in the dark, Marcus Crane was riding. Somewhere further east, in a house built on stolen money, Arthur Voss was sitting in a room that Ellie had escaped, still certain that what had run from him would be returned to him because, in his experience, everything he decided to keep eventually came back. They did not know Eleanor Voss, not the woman who had crawled through the wreckage of 8 dead people and kept moving in the dark. Not the woman who had fired a rifle for the first time in her life an hour ago and hit what she aimed at by the 5th shot. Not the woman sitting in that cabin right now running her thumb across the edge of a satchel that held 22 years of stolen truth. Cole rocked slow, listened to the dark. Tomorrow he would finish packing. The day after they would ride north into the mountains on a road he had mapped for someone he had loved and lost toward a courthouse that had no idea what was coming. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the last quiet before something began. In Boston, at approximately that same hour, a telegram arrived at the house on Beacon Hill. Arthur Voss read it standing at his desk, the way he read everything, without sitting, without leaning, as if the act of sitting might suggest the information required more adjustment than he was willing to admit. His eyes moved across the lines once, then again. The wagon train had been handled, one survivor status uncertain. He set the telegram face down on the desk, poured 2 fingers of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard, drank half of it without tasting it. Uncertain, he said, to the empty room was not the same as gone, and Mhonan was the only outcome that closed the matter. He picked up the telephone, told the operator the number, waited through the clicks in the silence of a long-distance connection assembling itself. When the line connected, he said only, "She's still alive. Find her, and when you do bring her back, not a body, her." He finished the brandy. A body could not be committed to a sanatorium. A body could not be made to recant. A body could not be displayed to the people of Boston as proof that Eleanor Voss had simply finally fully surrendered to the nervous instability that 3 licensed physicians had already documented in legal language. He needed her breathing. For now. He set the glass down precisely the way he set down every object in its correct position, without excess force, without the slightest suggestion that anything was not exactly as it should be. He sat down. He opened the newspaper and found the page he had been reading before the telegram arrived. He resumed reading. They left before the sun cleared the hills. The sky was the color of an old bruise when Cole led both horses out of the barn and checked the saddle straps in the dark by feel alone. He had done this particular task enough times that his hands didn't need light. Cinch buckles settled the weight, checked the balance. He checked the rifle twice, counted the ammunition in the saddlebag, filled both canteens from the pump, and listened to the water run. Ellie was already on the porch when he brought the horses around. She was wearing the spare shirt he had left folded on the chair in the side room, his large on her sleeves rolled past the elbows, her own skirt washed and dried, stiff on the fence line. She had pulled her dark hair back and pinned it flat under the brim of the borrowed hat. The satchel was pressed against her ribs beneath the shirt, the strap looped over one shoulder. You could see the faint outline of it if you knew what you were looking at. Cole had learned to know what he was looking at. She came down the porch steps without holding the rail. Her ribs still hurt. He could tell by the way she moved the slight brace in each step, the controlled quality of her breathing. She had stopped mentioning it. He had stopped asking. There was nothing useful in the exchange, and both of them understood that. He handed her the reins of the roan. She took them the way she had been practicing. Thumb up, light grip. She mounted without help and settled into the saddle and looked north toward the hills, where the sky was just beginning to separate from the land in a thin line of gray. "Let's go," she said. They did not look back at the cabin. The trail narrowed within the first hour. Dry grass gave way to loose rock, and the ground began to slope upward, the foothills rising on both sides like walls drawing in from a great distance. The horses worked steadily. The morning was cool in the way July mornings sometimes are in the high country, before the heat remembers itself and returns with authority. Cole rode ahead, his blue work shirt and brown leather vest dark against the pale rock. He kept his eyes moving. Ridge line, the near tree line, any depression in the ground where a man on horseback might wait with patience and a clear view. There was nothing, just the wind coming off the upper elevations and the sound of two horses breathing in rhythm. Ellie rode close behind. She had stopped gripping the saddle horn by the third day of practice. Now she moved with the horse rather than against it. A small adjustment, but distance makes small things significant. For the first long stretch of the morning, neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have run out of introductory things to say and have not yet decided whether to go deeper or stay quiet. Cole had always been better at the quiet. Della used to say he could go 3 days without talking and come out the other side having said everything that needed saying just by being present in a room. She had meant it as a compliment. He had taken it as one. He thought about Della more in these days on the trail than he had in months. The route was the reason. Every mile north brought him closer to the path he had charted and never walked. He recognized landmarks he had only seen on paper, a rock formation shaped like a broken chimney on the eastern ridge, a creek crossing, where two trails met and one of them went nowhere useful. He had marked all of these things 3 years ago, sitting at the table with a lamp and a pencil and a particular kind of desperate hope that had turned out to have an expiration date he hadn't known about. He rode the route now the way you do something you plan for someone else, with the awareness that the thing you are doing has a history and the history is present whether you acknowledge it or not. He acknowledged it, set it aside, kept riding. The image came to Ellie the way certain memories do, without invitation, without warning, arriving in the middle of an ordinary motion. She had just reached forward to adjust the roan's bridle when she saw it. Not the trail ahead. Something else entirely. A room in a house on Beacon Hill in Boston. Evening light through tall windows. The smell of furniture oil and the particular kind of silence that belongs to rooms where voices are never raised, not because there is peace in them, but because everything that happens there happens quietly, without witnesses, without record. She saw Arthur's hand close around her wrist. Not violent. That was never how he did it. He was too careful for violence that left marks where they could be seen. He simply closed his hand around her wrist, the way a man closes his hand around a doorknob, with the absolute expectation of what would follow. She had been holding a pen. She had been about to sign her name on a letter she had written herself to a relative in Philadelphia. A simple letter, nothing dangerous in it, nothing that said anything except that she was well and hoped they were too. He had taken the pen from her hand, set it on the desk, walked out of the room, left her standing there with the unsigned letter in front of her and the particular sensation of having had something removed so smoothly and so completely that she had stood for a full minute, trying to remember what it was. She blinked. The trail came back, the sound of the horses, the smell of sage and warm rock. She rode on. Walt Hensley lived at the midpoint between nowhere and somewhere else. His place was a low building of raw timber and packed earth, sitting alone on a flat stretch where two creek beds crossed. A corral with 4 horses, a woodpile that suggested a man who planned well ahead, and a front step worn smooth from long use. A pair of old harness hung on a nail by the door. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, steady line that said someone was home and intended to stay. The old man was outside splitting wood when they rode in. He stopped when he saw them. Set the axe against the block, looked at Cole, then at Ellie, and arrived at some private conclusion that he kept to himself in the manner of a man who has learned to observe before he speaks. "Watering stop," Cole said. "And grain, if you've got it." "Got grain. Got coffee too if you're not in a hurry." They weren't in a hurry the way people who are in a hurry always say they aren't. But the horses needed water, and the sun was high, and Ellie's face had gone tight in the way it did when she had been in the saddle longer than her ribs wanted. They tied the horses at the trough. Walt put coffee on. Inside, the single room smelled of pine tar and wood smoke, and something baking that turned out to be cornbread. He set 3 cups on the table and poured without ceremony, the way people who live alone learn to perform hospitality without the ritual of it, because ritual assumes a social context they have long since stopped needing. Ellie wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved through her palms and up her wrists, and she closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and let it be the only thing she was paying attention to. "You heading for Fort Ellis?" Walt said. It was not entirely a question. Cole looked at him. What makes you say that Walt settled into his chair with the particular slowness of a man whose joints have spent decades earning their opinions? Only reason anyone comes through this valley heading northwest in July. The Army and people who need the Army. He looked at Ellie, sometimes both at once. Cole said nothing. Walt sipped his coffee. Had a man through here 2 days back, Walt said, heading the same direction as you, but coming from the east. Good horse, good clothes, not good eyes. He asked me if I'd seen a man and a woman riding together. The coffee cup stopped moving in Ellie's hands. Walt looked at his own cup. Told him I hadn't seen a soul in a week, which was true until you two rode up. Why'd I lie for strangers? He set the cup down. Because of the way he asked about the woman. Not like a man looking for someone he missed. Like a man describing property that had wandered off a fence line. He paused. I've seen that look before. On a man who used to come around asking about my daughter. The room was quiet. Outside, one of the horses moved at the trough. Water sloshed against wood. Your daughter, Ellie said. Nora. He said the name the way you say the name of something that cost you everything and was worth every cent of it. Walt looked at the table. She married a man out of Denver. Good family, people said. Respectable. She wrote me letters for a year and a half that said she was happy. Then the letters stopped. When I went to find her, she was in a sanatorium outside of Denver. Her husband had put her there. Had 3 doctors sign the paperwork. Said she was delusional. Said she'd been making accusations against him that no rational woman would make. Ellie's hands had gone very still on the cup. What kind of accusations, she asked. That he'd stolen her inheritance from her father's estate, used it to clear his debts, and put the remainder into accounts that bore only his name. Walt's jaw tightened. The doctors said she was suffering from nervous collapse brought on by an unstable female temperament. That's the phrase they used. He looked at Ellie directly. You recognize that language, I think. Yes, she said quietly. I recognize it. Took me 3 months and every dollar I had saved for 20 years to get her out. I had to find a lawyer 2 states over who wasn't connected to her husband's circle. Had to petition a federal magistrate who was new enough to the bench that he hadn't yet been reached by the men who would have wanted to stop me. He shook his head slowly. She's in Oregon now. Small house, a garden. She's all right. She just needed someone to believe her before the people who didn't believe her had enough time to make the lie permanent. He reached for the coffee pot and refilled all 3 cups without asking. Do you remember the name of the doctor who signed the papers, Ellie asked. Walt thought for a moment. Moat, Harlan Moat. Boston address if I recall correctly. Struck me as odd at the time. Why would a Denver man use a doctor from Boston for something that personal? Something happened in Ellie's face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone who has suspected the shape of something terrible for a long time and has just been shown its actual dimensions. Because Harlan Moat wasn't Nora's husband's doctor, she said. He was a contractor. He signs papers for men like your daughter's husband. He signed mine 7 years ago. Arthur hired him and 2 others for an afternoon. They examined me for 2 hours and produced a document that said I was unfit for independent judgment. She set her cup down carefully with the precision of someone who has learned to be careful with everything. Because carelessness has costs she cannot afford. Dr. Moat is not an outlier. He's a service. Walt looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, went to the shelf, and came back with a folded piece of paper. Box Elder Canyon, he said, spreading it on the table. Shortcut I've used for 20 years. Cuts a full day off the route to Fort Ellis. Rough trail, but your horses look sound. He drew the path with one weathered finger. Take the left fork at the dead pine. The right fork drops off into nothing about a quarter-mile in. Don't take the right, Cole studied it. Why are you telling us this? Walt picked up his coffee. Because when a woman comes through my place with that look in her eyes, the one my Nora had, I don't ask questions. I just point the way. Ellie reached across the table and placed her hand over the old man's. He looked down at it. Then he patted it, once rough and gentle, the way people touch things they understand the value of and don't need to explain. Get where you need to go, Walt said. They found Box Elder Canyon in the mid-afternoon and followed it northwest as the walls rose on either side, and the July heat dropped by 10 degrees in the shade. The horses settled into the terrain with the focused energy of the animals, who feel the ground change beneath them and adjust without being told. Cole rode with his rifle across the saddle. The canyon was quiet in the way that canyons are quiet not empty of sound but layered with it, water running somewhere below the rocks, wind moving through the narrow opening above, the occasional sharp call of a bird that echoed off stone and returned from three directions at once, changed by the distance. Ellie rode close. She had been quieter since they left Walt's place. Not withdrawn, processing. Cole had come to recognize the difference in her silences, the ones that were closed and the ones that were working. "Do you think he's right?" she asked eventually. "That Moat does this for multiple men." "I think a man who makes his living that way doesn't stop at one client," Cole said. "That means this isn't just Arthur," she said. "If Moat has signed papers for other men, and those men have done what Arthur did, there are other women, somewhere, in places like that Denver sanatorium or worse." She paused. "And no one is connecting them because every case looks like a private family matter. Every case has its own walls." Cole said nothing. He let the thought sit in the air between them because it was the kind of thought that deserved room. Ellie said, "Those papers in the satchel, Arthur's papers, if they show what I know they show, it doesn't just prove what he did to my father. It proves the system he used to do it. The forged documents, the judge he paid, the doctor he hired, every piece of it is in there. Dated, signed, in Arthur's own handwriting because Arthur was arrogant enough to believe he would never need to hide it from himself." Cole looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when I walk into that federal courthouse, I'm not walking in just to save my father's money." She looked ahead at the canyon walls, a strip of sky above them. "I'm walking in to break the thing that let Arthur do what he did. The system, the connections, the network of men who make these things possible and then look in the other direction." The horses moved through the canyon. Stones shifted under their hooves. The sound bounced off the walls and came back altered. Cole thought about the 8 people on the Bozeman Trail, about the man face down with his hat still on, about the child's boot lying alone in the wheel rut, about the way Ellie had held that satchel in unconsciousness, knuckles white, not letting go, even when the rest of her had surrendered to staying awake. "That's a heavy thing to carry into a courtroom," he said. "I've been carrying heavier things into smaller rooms my whole life," she said. 200 miles to the east, Marcus Crane sat at a table in a relay station outside of Billings and read the instructions Arthur Voss had sent by telegraph. He had read them twice already. He read them a third time now because the third time was when the meaning of certain words became something you could no longer choose not to understand. At the bottom of the page in Arthur's careful hand, "If she cannot be returned intact, do not return her." Crane folded the paper, placed it in his coat pocket. He had done this work for 11 years. He had returned 7 women to 7 men who had described their wives the way Arthur described Eleanor: unstable, confused, in need of management and care. They were unwilling to provide themselves. He had never asked what happened after he delivered them. He had found over 11 years that the money arrived faster when he didn't ask. He looked out the window at the dark country north of Billings. Somewhere up there in the mountains, with a man nobody had properly accounted for. A rancher, a nobody with 40 acres and a horse and the kind of stubbornness that comes from having nothing left to lose. Crane had underestimated that particular kind of man before. He had learned not to. He paid for his coffee, went to saddle his horse. She was up there. He would find her. He always did. They made camp at the canyon's mouth as the light failed. Cole built a fire low just enough for coffee and warmth. The horses were hobbled in a patch of grass near the creek. The canyon walls rose on 3 sides, and above the open end, the Montana sky came out with everything it had, stars so thick and close they looked like something spilled rather than placed. Ellie sat across the fire with the satchel in her lap and the small pistol Cole had given her resting near her knee. "Tell me about Della," she said. Cole poured coffee, set the pot back on the flat rock near the coals. "She was the first person who ever looked at me and decided I was worth keeping," he said. "I was nobody when I met her. Ranch hand working somebody else's cattle for $30 a month. She was the school's teacher in Bozeman. She'd read more books in a single year than I had in my entire life. Smart enough to have married a doctor or a lawyer or anyone who could give her a proper house and a proper name. She chose you," Ellie said. "She chose me." He looked into the fire. "And every day for 11 years I tried to be worth it. Some days I did better than others." "How did you know that it was real?" Orm was quiet for a moment. The fire popped softly. She got sick once, he said, long before the fever that took her. A bad winter cold that turned into something worse. I sat beside her bed for 4 days. Didn't eat, hardly slept. On the third night, she opened her eyes and looked at me and said he stopped, almost smiled at the memory of it. She said, if you die of starvation sitting next to me, Hargrove, I will never forgive you. And I laughed. First time I laughed in 4 days. He set the coffee cup down between his boots. And I thought that's the whole thing. Right there. Someone who can make you laugh when you're scared out of your mind. That's what it is. That's the whole definition of it. Ellie looked at the fire for a while. Arthur never made me laugh, she said. Not once, not in 22 years. It was not self-pity, she wasn't given to that. It was more like accounting. Reading a ledger and noting without particular emotion what was missing from one column. Not once, she said again. I don't think he considered it part of the arrangement. Cole looked at her across the fire. Then he never deserved a single day of it, he said. Something moved in her face. Fast. A flicker behind the eyes that she turned away before it could become something more. Don't, she said. Her voice was still steady, but something underneath it was not. Don't what? Don't be kind to me like that. Not now. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, the gesture of someone holding something down that wants to rise. I need the anger to stay intact. I need to walk into that courthouse with nothing soft in me, nothing that gives when pressed. If you make me feel what I've been keeping locked away, she stopped. I'll lose my edge, and I cannot afford to lose my edge. Not now, not yet. He held her gaze across the fire. Being cared about doesn't make you soft, he said. It makes you certain, and certain is what you need when you walk through that door. She pressed her lips together hard, turned away for a full minute. When she turned back, her eyes were clear and her jaw was set, and she looked like a woman who had picked up a very heavy thing and decided after consideration that she would carry it the rest of the way. We ride at first light, she said. Yes, ma'am. She lay down with the satchel beneath her head and the pistol in her hand and closed her eyes. Cole sat with the rifle across his knees and watched the canyon mouth and drank his coffee and let the fire burn down to coals. Somewhere far above in the high rocks, something moved through the dark with the particular patience of a creature that understood how long waiting was worth. Cole understood it too. They reached the pass on the evening of the 11th day. The horses had worked hard for the last 4 hours. The trail had narrowed to barely a horse width, switchbacking up the face of the mountain in a series of cuts that required total concentration and the nerve to keep looking forward. Cole did not look down at the drop on his right. He told Ellie not to either. Watch Lucy's tail, he said. Where she goes, your horse goes. Don't think about the drop. I'm not thinking about the drop. What are you thinking about? What I'll say to Arthur Svig when they bring him into a courtroom. Good, Cole said. Keep thinking about that. They reached the top just as the last light bled out of the sky. The ground leveled into a narrow flat between two ridges. The air was thin and cold and tasted of stone and elevation. Both horses were breathing hard, sides working. Cole dismounted and pressed his hand to Lucy's chest, felt the hammering of her heart. He patted her neck. She turned her head and looked at him with the particular expression that horses use when they want to express an opinion about the decisions humans make. Cole, I know, girl. Ellie, still mounted, looked down at him. Is she all right, Cole? She's fine. She's just telling me what she thinks of this route. Ellie, what does she think, Cole? Something I'd rather not repeat. Ellie almost laughed. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, not ahead, behind, below. The sound coming up the switchbacks, bouncing off the rock face and arriving distorted, but unmistakable. 2 horses at minimum, maybe 3. Moving faster than was sensible for the conditions, which meant they were either desperate or very confident. How close, Ellie asked. Her voice had dropped. He held up one hand and listened. 15 minutes, he said. Maybe less. Crane. Maybe. Could be. You don't believe that? He did not answer. He pulled the rifle from the scabbard and checked the load by the fading light. 1 round chambered. 4 more in the magazine. Get behind the outcrop, he said. The one on the left. Stay down, stay quiet, stay out of the line of fire until you have a clear shot. And if I have a shot, take it. Don't wait for me to tell you. She moved without hesitation, sliding from the saddle and moving to the outcrop with the low, fast economy of someone who has been paying attention to every lesson. They came up out of the last switchback single file, 3 riders. The first was Crane. Cole had never seen the man, but he knew him immediately. The kind of man who carries himself like the outcome of the situation has already been determined, and he has simply arrived to collect the result. The second and third were hired guns, a different breed entirely. Practical men who had made a career out of someone else's problems. What happened in the next 4 minutes happened the way most dangerous things happen, fast, loud, and not according to anyone's plan. Cole fired first. The shot went wide of Crane. Return fire came immediately from the second rider, and Cole felt the bullet pass his left shoulder before he heard it, the particular displacement of air when something moving very fast passes close enough to matter. He dropped behind the rock. A second shot. This one caught him, high on the left side above the shoulder blade. The impact was less than the burn that followed it, and the burn was considerable. He kept the rifle up. From the outcrop on the left, a single shot, clean and flat, with no hesitation in it. The second rider went off his horse and did not get up. Crane and the third man wheeled their horses. Crane was shouting something. The third man fired twice toward the outcrop. Stone chips flew. No cry. Cole rose from behind the rock and fired again. The shot took Crane across the upper right arm, not stopping him, not killing him, but enough to make his grip on the reins go clumsy. The third man's horse bolted sideways and carried him off the trail at a speed that settled the question of whether he would be a continuing problem. Crane made a decision, the arithmetic of survival, completed quickly by a man who had done it before, and rode back down the switchback at a pace that said he had substantially revised his earlier confidence. The pass went quiet. Cole leaned against the rock face, put his hand to his left shoulder, came away wet. Ellie was at his side before he had fully processed that she had moved. She crouched beside him, her hands already going to the wound with a directness that came not from training, but from decision. "How bad?" she said. "Pass through," he said. "Didn't stay. Then we manage it. Sit down. I'm fine standing." "Sit down, Cole." Something in her voice settled the discussion. He sat. She tore a strip from the bottom of her own shirt because it was the cleanest available fabric and folded it into a compress. She pressed it against the entry wound with both hands and held it there, without flinching at any sound he made. "Hold this," she said. He put his hand over hers. She was already tearing a second strip, working by the dim last light of the sky with the efficiency of someone whose hands had decided to be useful instead of afraid. "You didn't run," he said. "No. You had a clear shot and you took it." She looked at him. There was something in her face that was harder than before the pass, not cold, just arrived. The look of someone who has crossed a line they cannot cross back over and has decided they are at peace with where they are standing. "He was going to kill us," she said. "I know what men like that are paid to do." She pressed the bandage tight. "Now hold still." She worked fast and well. He had seen her hands shake when she first shot at tin cans on a fence rail. They did not shake now. He looked across the pass at the rider in the dirt 20 feet away. The man had a saddlebag that had come open when he fell. Papers were scattered on the ground, pale against the dark rock. "Check that bag," Cole said. Ellie looked at it, then at him. Then she stood and crossed to it and knelt in the dirt and gathered the papers by feel in the near dark. She was quiet for a long moment, longer than the task required. "Cole," she said. He heard something in her voice that made him stand, despite what his shoulder was currently telling him about that decision. She held the papers toward him. He found the small lamp from the saddlebag, shielded it with his body against the wind, lit it low. In the small circle of yellow light, they read together. The first page was a copy of the commitment order, the one signed by Thatcher Fenton, the federal judge in Helena. Ellie's name. Ellie's description. The language about mental instability rendered in the precise formal vocabulary of documents that have been designed to be difficult to argue with. He had heard her describe it. Seeing it in print with an official seal was different. It had a weight that described things never quite achieved. The second page was smaller, a half sheet written in a different hand. Cramped and practical, the handwriting of someone for whom words are tools rather than expression. $50,000 if returned intact, it read. No payment for any other outcome. Ellie read it twice. Then she set it down carefully on the rock beside her. "He valued my silence at $50,000, she said quietly. He stole 400,000 from my father, and he thought he could buy me for an eighth of it. Cole folded both papers, put them inside his own coat against his chest. People like Arthur always underestimate the thing they should be most afraid of, he said. She looked at him. What thing is that? A woman who decided the price he was offering was too low. She stood, helped him to his feet. The horses were still on the pass, shaken but present. They had not bolted. Cole had chosen his horses well. They rode down the western slope in the dark. Slow. The horses chose their own footing, and they let them do it. By the time the slope leveled out into the valley below, the sky ahead was beginning to separate from the land in the first suggestion of approaching dawn. Ellie did not speak for a long time. Cole did not fill the silence. Finally, she said, "He'll get word to Fenton now. Tell him which direction we went. Arthur has been planning this since before I left Boston. Every step I thought I was choosing, he'd already mapped it." Cole kept his eyes on the valley floor ahead of them. "Fort Ellis has army men," he said. "Crane can't walk in and take you. He doesn't need to walk in and take me." She said it quietly with the flat certainty of someone who has thought this through already, probably more than once. He just needs to show them the commitment order, signed by a federal judge. The Army follows the law, and the law, as Arthur has arranged it, says I'm a patient who escaped medical care. Captain Calloway will be caught between a legal document and a woman with a story. Legal documents are easier to trust than stories. Cole thought about that for a moment. "Then we make sure our story is in the right hands before Crane arrives," he said. "And if it isn't," he looked at her. "I've got 40 acres, 2 horses, a rifle, and I don't owe a single man on this earth a thing." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, as simple reported fact. "That makes me a particular kind of dangerous. The kind your husband doesn't know how to calculate for." "What kind is that?" "A man with nothing left to lose who found something worth protecting." She held his gaze. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted and steady as anything he had ever looked at directly. "That's the most dangerous kind there is," she said. Fort Ellis appeared in the late afternoon of the 12th day. Wood smoke and the smell of horses and the low continuous sound of men working. A garrison built for function, not appearance, sitting on a flat stretch of ground with the mountains behind it and a clear line of sight in every direction that mattered. The flag above the gate hung still in the windless heat. Ellie straightened in the saddle when she saw it. Her hand went unconsciously to her ribs, checking. Then she put it back on the reins. They rode to the gate. A young corporal came out with a rifle and the expression of a man performing his duty with reasonable attention. He looked at Cole, then at Ellie, then at the weapons on both saddles and the dried blood on Cole's shoulder. "State your business. Name's Cole Hargrove. I've got a claim west of the Bozeman Trail. This woman needs to send a wire to the federal marshal's office in Helena. It concerns a criminal matter. Federal jurisdiction." "What kind of criminal matter?" "Fraud. Forgery. 8 dead civilians on the Bozeman Trail. 17 days ago, give it your take." The corporal looked at Ellie. She looked back at him without blinking. He lowered the rifle an inch. "Wait here." He disappeared through the gate. They waited in the heat. Ellie's horse shifted beneath her. She steadied him with her knee without looking down. "Breathe," Cole said. "I'm breathing. You're holding your breath and calling it breathing. Those aren't the same thing." She exhaled hard, almost laughed. "You're insufferable." "So I've been told." Captain Bard Calloway came through the gate with the corporal behind him. He was a man of 50-something, thick at the shoulders, with a gray mustache and the walk of someone who had spent more of his life outdoors than behind a desk and considered that a reasonable trade. He looked at Cole, looked at Ellie, took in the dried blood on Cole's shoulder and the fading bruise on Ellie's jaw, and the particular posture of both of them, upright and watchful, the way people sit when they have been watching their backs long enough for it to become structural. "Hargrove," he said. "Captain, your corporal says federal matter." "Yes, sir." Calloway looked at Ellie. She met his eyes directly. "You were on the wagon train," he said. "I was the reason there was a wagon train attack," she said. "My name is Eleanor Voss. My husband is Arthur Voss of Boston. He has forged documents, stolen an estate, bribed a federal judge, and paid for the murder of 8 people to prevent me from reaching a federal courthouse. I have the evidence. I have his papers. And I need to send a wire to the federal marshal in Helena before a man named Marcus Crane arrives at your gate with a commitment order and a story designed to make me disappear." Calloway held her gaze for a long moment, the kind of moment that contains a complete evaluation of a person. "Come inside," he said. They followed him through the gate. Calloway took them to his office desk, two chairs, a map on the wall, a flag in the corner. Sparse and functional as the man himself. He sat and folded his hands. "Talk," he said. Ellie placed the satchel on the desk. She opened it. She laid the papers out one by one the way you lay out a hand of cards you have been holding for a very long time and have finally decided the moment is right to play. She talked for 40 minutes. When she finished, Calloway looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "Corporal," he said through the open door, "get me a telegraph form." The reply came 2 hours later. Cole and Ellie were sitting on a bench outside the telegraph office when Calloway walked across the yard toward them with a paper in his hand and an expression that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. He held the paper out to Ellie. She read it again. The paper said that a federal inquiry had been opened into the conduct of Judge Thatcher Fenton, based on corroborating intelligence received from two separate sources within the week. The wire from Fort Ellis had been the second such source. Pending investigation, Fenton's recent orders were under review, including any commitment orders issued within the last 60 days. Marshal Gideon Ware was being dispatched from Helena with full federal authority. He would arrive in 3 days. Cole watched Ellie's face while she read. He had watched her face for 12 days. He had watched it be afraid and calculating and exhausted and determined and something close to broken and then determined again. Now he watched it do something he had not seen it do before. Let go. Not of everything, not permanently, just for one moment standing in the dust of an army fort in the late afternoon, holding a piece of paper that said the world had started moving in the direction of truth. Something that had been locked very, very tight released its hold just slightly. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders came down from where they had been living for 12 days. Cole did not reach for her. He sat still and let her have it because some things need space more than they need comfort. When she lowered her hand, she was not crying. She was something better than crying. She was standing straighter. "He's not going to win," she said. "Said it to a witness. Said it out loud so it could not be taken back." "No," Cole said. "He's not." Calloway said, "Mrs. Voss Eleanor," she said, without heat. Just the plain correction of a woman who has been someone else's property long enough to be precise about her own name. "Ma'am, we'll post extra men at the gate tonight. Crane arrives, he'll be detained and questioned. His papers won't hold against a federal review order. He'll say you have no authority," Ellie said. "He can say whatever he likes." Calloway's voice was flat and unhurried. "This is a United States Army installation. I answer to the chain of command, and that chain currently runs through Marshal Ware's office in Helena, not through a Boston lawyer's pocket." He paused. "You're under my protection until Ware arrives." Something broke very quietly in Ellie's face. A hairline fracture in something that had been sealed for a long time. The thinnest line of light. "Thank you, Captain," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. Calloway nodded, turned and walked back across the yard. Cole and Ellie stayed on the bench. The sun was lowering. The shadows of the fort walls stretched long across the ground. Somewhere inside the garrison, someone was playing a mouth harp, the sound thin and plaintive and exactly right for the hour. "Are you all right?" Cole asked. She thought about it. "I've been asking myself what I would feel when something finally went right," she said. She looked at the paper in her hands. "I expected relief, maybe some anger that it took this long." She paused. "What I actually feel is tired. Just very, very tired. Like something I was holding up finally has something under it, and my arms don't know what to do now that they're not doing the holding." Cole said, "That's what it feels like when you've been strong for a long time, and you're finally somewhere safe enough to let the strength rest for a minute." She looked at him. "Is that what this is? Somewhere safe?" He looked at the walls, the men at the gate, the telegraph line running north toward Helena. "Safe enough," he said. She leaned back against the wall and looked up at the strip of sky above the fort's interior. The still, clear, enormous blue of a Montana summer evening that didn't care about any of what had happened and would be exactly the same blue tomorrow and the day after regardless. 3 more days, she said. 3 more days. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe all the way to the bottom. Cole sat beside her in the last of the light and kept his eyes on the gate. Then Calloway's voice came from across the yard. He was walking back toward them with a second paper in his hand. His expression had changed from the careful neutrality of before. Something else was in it now. The look of a man who has received information he did not want to receive and is not sure how to carry it across a yard. He held it out without preamble. It was a second telegraph, sent from the Federal Circuit Office in Helena, routed through the Army wire. Ellie took it, read it. Her hands went completely still on the paper. Judge Thatcher Fenton, she said. He moved before Ware could act. Calloway said, this morning, he filed an emergency injunction. Any documents obtained without the explicit consent of the legal owner from a private residence in Massachusetts are classified as stolen property pending judicial review. Until the injunction is lifted, he stopped. Chose his next words carefully. Those documents cannot be entered into federal evidence. The papers in the satchel, 22 years of proof, inadmissible. Cole looked at Ellie. Her face had not broken. But something behind it had, he could see it, the specific quality of a person who has run 1,000 miles and arrived to find the door locked from the inside by the person who was supposed to open it. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she said quietly, he knew we were coming. He moved before we arrived. Calloway said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Ellie looked down at the satchel in her lap, at the paper she had carried across a mountain range with cracked ribs and borrowed everything with 8 dead people in the accounting of how she had gotten here. Cole, she said. Yeah. She looked up. Her eyes were not defeated. They were something harder than defeat, the expression of a person who has lost the weapon they plan to use and is already looking for another one. Working the problem. Still moving. He doesn't know about Crane, she said. He doesn't know Crane is behind us. He doesn't know what Crane is carrying. Cole was very still. The papers in Crane's saddlebag, she said. The commitment order. The payment note. None of that came from Arthur's study. Crane carried those himself, from Boston, under his own authority. She looked at Calloway. They are not covered by Fenton's injunction. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cole, then back at Ellie. When Crane arrives at that gate, she said, and he will arrive, he will be carrying the evidence that breaks the injunction. He just doesn't know it yet. Cole sat beside her in the last of the light and kept watch on the gate. 3 more days. The night before the marshals arrived, Ellie could not sleep. She lay on the cot in the officers' quarters that Captain Calloway had assigned her, a narrow room, a single window, a wool blanket folded at the foot of the mattress, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the fort settle around her. Boots on gravel, the distant exchange of 2 men on watch, a horse shifting in the stable. The mouth harp had stopped an hour ago. Everything was quiet the way places are quiet when they are full of people who have agreed collectively to be still for the night. She was not still. She had been lying here for 2 hours running through the same set of calculations she had been running for 22 years. The difference was that now the variables had changed and her mind had not yet learned to trust the new numbers. Every time she arrived at an outcome that looked like safety, some part of her went back to the beginning and ran it again, searching for the catch. Because there was always a catch. Arthur had taught her that thoroughly and well over many years and in many rooms. She got up, put on her boots, crossed the narrow hallway and knocked on the door across from hers. Cole opened it after a moment. He was still dressed. She had suspected he would be. He looked at her without surprise, the way he looked at most things, as if he had already considered the possibility and was simply waiting to see which version of it arrived at his door. She said, I know what I'm going to say in that courtroom. I've been rehearsing it in my head since before I left Boston. But I keep stopping at the same place. He stepped back from the door. She came in and sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the edge of the cot. The lamp was burning low, putting a warm circle of light on the floor between them, like a small patient fire. Where do you stop? He asked. At the handwriting, she said. My father's handwriting. In the last 2 years of his life, he had Parkinson's disease. His hands shook. Not badly at first, but by the end you could see it clearly in every letter he wrote. A tremor in the downstroke of certain letters. Distinctive. Specific to him in the way that particular physical failures always are. She paused. Arthur had the will forged, and whoever did it was competent enough to copy my father's. general hand, his letter formation, his preferred spacing. But they didn't know about the tremor. The forged signature is clean, controlled. It doesn't shake. She looked at her own hands in the lamplight. I have 2 documents my father signed in the last month of his life. Letters he wrote to me. The tremor is in both of them. When I put those letters next to the will in front of a jury, the difference is visible to anyone with eyes and the willingness to use them. Cole said, then that's what breaks it. She said Arthur's lawyers will say the forgery argument is a fabrication. They'll say, I'm a woman with a documented history of instability, making accusations against a man of standing, because I'm unable to accept the terms of my father's legitimate estate planning. And what will you say? She was quiet for a moment, assembling something she had been building for a long time. I'll say that my father built $400,000 from a single loom in a rented room, that he worked 40 years to leave something behind for his only child, that the man who took it did so with a pen and a paid judge and a network of doctors who sign papers for money and a lawyer who hunts women for hire. She straightened in the chair. And then I'll lay those 2 letters on the table next to the forged will, and I'll ask the jury to look at the handwriting and tell me which signature belongs to a man whose hands shook in the last year of his life. Cole looked at her across the lamplight. Nobody is going to be able to look at that inside with Arthur, he said. Some of them will try, she said. Some of them will fail. She held his gaze. The lamp popped softly. Outside, the watch changed boots on gravel, a low exchange, then quiet. Cole, she said. Yeah. When this is over, she stopped. Started differently. I've been so focused on getting to the other side of this that I haven't let myself think past it. Past the courthouse, past the verdict. She looked at the window, the dark square of Montana sky beyond the glass. I don't know what I look like on the other side. I don't know what a day feels like when there's no one coming after me. Cole said nothing for a moment. He looked at his hands, at the rough skin across the knuckles, the particular stillness of a man who has learned to let silence do work that words would only interrupt. You look like someone who gets to find out, he said. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we finish this. She stood, crossed to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. I believe we do, she said. She paused, one hand still on the frame. When this is finished, when it's really finished, there's something I want to tell you. Something I have never said to any man. She did not wait for his answer. She went back to her room. This time she slept. Marcus Crane arrived at the gate of Fort Ellis at 7 in the morning. Ellie heard about it from Calloway 20 minutes later. She was in the mess hall with Cole drinking coffee that was strong enough to require a considered commitment when the captain appeared in the doorway. Your man is at the gate, Calloway said. Crane riding alone. His right arm is in a sling. He has a document case and the expression of someone who believes his paperwork outranks this garrison. Ellie set her cup down. He's going to present Fenton's commitment order, she said. He already did. Calloway said, I took it. I told him it was under review, pending a federal inquiry into Judge Fenton's conduct, which is the truth. And I told him he would be detained for questioning in connection with the deaths of 8 civilians on the Bozeman Trail, which is also the truth. He looked at Cole. He's in the holding room. He asked for a lawyer. He is a lawyer, Cole said, which is why Calloway said he knows exactly how much trouble he is currently sitting in. Ellie stood. She did not ask if she could be present for the questioning. She simply looked at Calloway in a way that made the question unnecessary. Calloway said, you can observe. You won't be in the room. That's enough. The holding room was a small space off the main building with a single table and a window too high and narrow to be useful for anything but light. Crane sat at the table. Ellie stood in the corridor outside the open door, close enough to hear everything. She had never seen Marcus Crane before. She had felt his presence for 2 weeks in May Whitfield's quiet warning in the tracks Walt described in the shots fired on the mountain pass. She had built him in her mind the way you build any threat you cannot see, larger than life, more certain than human. What she saw was a man in his 40s, compact and careful with sharp eyes, in the controlled posture of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room he entered. His right arm was bandaged and bound against his chest. He moved it with the deliberate care of something that hurt more than he was willing to show. He was not what she had imagined. He was smaller, more tired, more human. That was its own kind of frightening. Calloway sat across from him. He asked his questions without theater, without applied pressure. Simply and directly, with long pauses between that, gave answers room to grow into themselves. Crane held his ground for 20 minutes. He cited his legal authority. He cited Fenton's order. He cited Arthur Voss's standing as a man of reputation and extensive legal resources who would have considerable opinions about how his representative was being treated. Then Calloway said, "Mr. Crane, I have a telegraph from the federal marshal's office in Helena that places Judge Fenton under inquiry for corruption. I have a woman down the hall who survived an attack that killed 8 people on the Bozeman Trail and is prepared to testify in detail about every event of the past 2 weeks, including the names and actions of the men who came after her. And I have your name provided by 2 separate witnesses in 2 separate towns connected to those events." He folded his hands on the table. "Now, you are a lawyer. You understand the difference between what you were hired to do and what you are now sitting in. You understand that the man who hired you has 3 attorneys in Boston preparing his defense and is not preparing yours." He paused. "So I will ask you once plainly, is there anything you want to tell me before Marshal Ware arrives from Helena, and this becomes a conversation you have no further influence over?" The silence in the holding room lasted a long time. Ellie stood in the corridor and did not move. Then Crane said quietly the name that changed everything. He said, "Fenton took money from Voss on 3 separate occasions. I was the courier for 2 of them. I can tell you the amounts, the dates, and the account numbers the money came from." Calloway did not react visibly. He simply reached for the paper on the table and said, "Start at the beginning." Ellie walked away from the door, stood against the corridor wall with both hands pressed flat against the wood paneling behind her, pressing hard, needing the solidity of something that was not moving. Cole was at the end of the corridor. He had not come forward. He was simply there the way he was always simply there, present, steady, requiring nothing from her except that she continue. She breathed. She continued. In Boston at approximately that same hour, Arthur Voss was sitting in his study with the morning paper and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he read it. He had not read a word of it. He had been looking at it for 40 minutes as a way of appearing to himself and to anyone who might observe him to be doing something ordinary. The habit of ordinary things was how he had managed every difficulty in 22 years of marriage and 30 years of business. You kept to the routine. You maintained the surface. You trusted the systems you had built to do the work below the surface that required doing. He trusted those systems now. Crane was efficient. Fenton was reliable. The commitment order was valid. Eleanor would be returned. The paper she had taken would be returned. Everything would resolve itself back to the correct configuration. He turned the page of the newspaper. The telephone on the desk rang. He answered it on the second ring as always. Unhurried. In control of the pace of things. The voice on the other end was his attorney in Helena. The man spoke for 90 seconds. He did not speak in a tone that suggested good news. Arthur did not interrupt. When the call ended, he set the receiver down carefully. Looked at his hands on the desk. For the first time in longer than he could remember, they were not steady. The right hand wrapped around the coffee cup he had picked up without thinking was trembling slightly. He looked at it the way he looked at all things that failed to perform as expected, with a cold, analytical attention, searching for the source of the failure. He set the cup down. He sat very still in the house that Eleanor had left in the chair where he had made every decision that had brought him to this particular morning, and he looked at his trembling hand, and he understood for the first time in 30 years of building systems that the systems were not going to be enough. He reached for the telephone. Then he stopped. Put his hand back on the desk. There was no one left to call. Marshal Gideon Ware rode through the gate of Fort Ellis on the morning of the 3rd day exactly as his telegraph had promised, with his deputy Callum Press beside him and 2 additional riders behind. Ware was 60 years old, lean, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked carved rather than grown. He had the particular unhurried quality of a man who had spent his career arriving at bad situations after everyone else had already made them worse, and who had learned that the first and most important thing to do was always to sit down and listen before deciding anything at all. He sat across from Ellie in Calloway's office and listened for a long time. She told it the way she had told it to no one before, not in fragments, not in the carefully rationed pieces she had offered Cole over campfires and porch evenings, but all of it in sequence from the beginning. Amos Britton in his rented room in Lowell with his single loom. 40 years of honest work building into something real. Arthur and the courtship that was a transaction wearing the clothing of affection. The marriage and the years that followed, each one narrower than the last, the walls of her life drawing imperceptibly inward season by season, until she looked up one day and understood that the space she had been allowed to occupy had become very small. She put the documents on the table as she reached them in the narrative. The forged will, the bank transfer records. The letters between Arthur and the probate judge letters Arthur had kept in a locked box in his study because he was the kind of man who kept proof of his own power like trophies, certain he would never need to hide it from himself. Then she placed the two personal letters her father had written her in the last month of his life, set them beside the forged will. The tremor in the handwriting was visible from across the table. Ware leaned forward, looked at the signatures side by side. His jaw tightened. Pressed beside him was very still. Ware said, "You've carried these for 6 months." "I've carried them longer than that in everything but paper," she said. He looked at her, the kind of look that takes a full, unhurried reading of a person before arriving at a conclusion. Then he said Mr. Crane in his statement to Captain Calloway confirmed that Thatcher Fenton received payment from Arthur Voss on 3 separate occasions. He confirmed the dates and the amounts and confirmed that the commitment order issued in your name was prepared at Arthur Voss's direction and that Fenton signed it in exchange for consideration. He paused. "That order is void. Judge Fenton is suspended pending criminal inquiry. He is no longer in a position to obstruct these proceedings in any form." Ellie's hands were flat on the table. "What happens now?" she asked. Ware said, "You traveled to Helena with my escort. You testified before a federal grand jury. These documents enter into evidence under my custody." He looked at the papers spread before him. "And the United States government makes its case against Arthur Voss." He stood. Ellie stood. Ware said, "Ma'am, in 30 years on this job, I have seen cases built on less than what you are carrying. And I have seen cases built on more that came to nothing because the witness did not hold when it mattered most." He looked at her directly. "Are you going to hold?" She looked back at him with the gray-green eyes that had been afraid and calculating and exhausted and determined over the past 2 weeks and were now simply clear. "I've been holding for 22 years, Marshal," she said. "I imagine I can manage a courtroom." They reached Helena on the 4th day of riding. The city was bigger than anything Ellie had seen since Boston. Brick buildings, paved streets, a courthouse with columns and a clock tower that announced the territory's aspirations. People moved on the sidewalks with the particular forward energy of a place that has decided it is in the process of becoming something significant. They went directly to the federal marshal's office. The documents were logged, cataloged, and locked in a vault. Ellie signed her name on 14 separate forms, each signature steady, each one feeling like driving a nail into something that had been needing it for a long time. The grand jury was convened 4 days later. She was called first. She had been in the waiting room for 2 hours before they brought her in. She had sat with her hands folded and her back straight and looked at the far wall, and she had gone through it one more time, not the facts, she knew the facts with absolute precision, but the feeling. She had let herself feel all of it in that waiting room. The 22 years of locked rooms and managed silences, and the particular exhaustion of being told over and over by every available mechanism of authority and social standing and professional opinion that what she knew to be true was merely evidence of her instability. She felt all of it. She let it be as large and as heavy and as legitimately angry as it actually was. She owed it that. Then she stood up when they called her name and she walked through the door and she began. She testified for 6 hours. She did not hurry and she did not stumble and she did not cry. She was precise. She was specific. She cited dates and amounts and names with the unflinching accuracy of someone who has spent years in a situation where details were the only power she possessed. She described the Bozeman Trail the way a witness describes a crime scene, with the clear factual detail of someone who was there and survived it and is not going to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. Arthur's 3 lawyers objected 17 times. The lead attorney was a man named Weston Price, sent up from San Francisco wearing the kind of suit that announced its cost without needing to state it. He was skilled and composed and very clearly accustomed to winning. He objected to her characterization of the marriage. Overruled. He objected to her description of the medical examinations. Overruled. He objected to the introduction of the personal letters as comparative handwriting evidence. Overruled. On the 16th objection, he shifted his approach. He stood and addressed the jury with the smooth authority of a man who had prepared this particular argument with considerable care. The witness before you, he said, has a documented medical history of emotional instability confirmed by 3 separate licensed physicians. She departed her husband's household without legal sanction. She transported documents taken without permission from a private residence. She is asking this jury to accept her personal account over the sworn professional opinions of medical men and the established standing of one of the most respected financiers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He paused for the effect he had practiced. This woman is not a credible witness, he said. She is. Ellie stood up. She did not wait to be recognized. She did not raise her hand or clear her throat or ask permission. She simply rose from the witness chair, and the quality of her rising, the absolute unhurried calm of it, the complete absence of performance, the way it contained everything that had happened to her for 22 years and wore none of it as spectacle, brought the room to silence before she said a word. Then she said it. I rode through the crazy mountains of Montana on horseback. With 2 cracked ribs and a rifle I learned to fire that summer. I survived an attack that killed 8 people. I traveled over 300 miles on a route that avoided every major road and relay station in the territory. I arrived at a federal marshal's office with documents that have now been authenticated, confirmed by a corroborating witness, and entered into federal evidence by Marshal Gideon Ware. She looked at Price. If that is the behavior of a woman who is not credible, she said, I would suggest that the word credible is doing work in this courtroom that the evidence before you is not supporting. She sat back down. The room was very quiet. Judge Aldous Merritt, a spare man in his 60s with the measured patience of someone who had presided over proceedings long enough to recognize the difference between theater and testimony, looked at Price over his spectacles. Sit down, counselor, he said. The grand jury returned an indictment in 4 hours. Fraud, forgery, bribery of a federal officer, conspiracy in the deaths of 8 civilians on the Bozeman Trail. Ellie was sitting outside in the corridor with Cole when Ware came through the door with the paper in his hand. He handed it to her without ceremony. She read it again. She pressed the paper flat against her knee with both hands and looked at the far wall for a moment. Cole, she said. Yeah, it's real. It's real. She turned to him. Her eyes were full, but she was smiling, not the careful, measured, near smiles he had seen on the porch and at the campfire and in the lamplight of the fort corridor. A real smile. The kind that uses the whole face, the kind that costs something to produce because it has been stored a long time. We did it, she said. You did it, Cole said. From the beginning to right now, every step of it was you. You carried me off a trail. You were already alive when I got there. She laughed. That sharp surprise sound he had come to know, the one that came out of her, when something reached past all the armor she had built and found something underneath that was still despite everything capable of delight. She took his hand, held it. They sat like that in the corridor of the federal building in Helena, Montana, while the world made the adjustments that were coming to it, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because nothing that needed saying required words to say it. Outside the window, Ware's deputy pressed past the doorway at a brisk walk. He glanced in and looked immediately away, with the practiced discretion of a man who had learned not to interrupt moments that were not his. Cole said Arthur will be arrested today. Probably this afternoon if the telegram reached Boston this morning. Ware put the timing at about Cole. Yeah, when they come to take him. When they knock on that door and put handcuffs on the man who told me I was nothing, who spent 22 years of my life operating on the premise that I was property, she stopped. She was still smiling, but there was something in it now that was different. Older. The smile of someone who has outlasted something they were never supposed to outlast. I want to know what his face looks like. Cole thought about it. Probably, he said, like a man who finally met the arithmetic he's been avoiding his entire life. She exhaled, leaned back against the wall. The late afternoon light came through the window and caught the silver in her hair and the particular quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of someone suppressing something, but the stillness of someone who has finally genuinely stopped running and discovered that the ground is solid. The telegram from Boston arrived 2 hours later. It was short. Factual. Ware read it aloud. Arthur Lowell Voss of Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts, was taken into federal custody at his residence at 4:15 in the afternoon. He was charged with fraud, forgery, bribery of a federal officer in conspiracy in the deaths of 8 persons on the Bozeman Trail, Montana territory. He made no statement at the time of arrest. Ellie took the telegram from Ware, read it herself. Then she folded it carefully once, twice, and put it in her coat pocket close against her. She walked outside. Cole followed her. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the federal building and looked up at the sky. It was late August. The heat had broken at the edges, a suggestion of fall moving through the mornings, the light going amber a little earlier each day. The sky above Helena was the blue of deep water, clear down to whatever bottom it had. She said quietly, not to Cole, but to somewhere further off, "I'm almost there, Papa. I'm almost there." Cole stood beside her and said nothing. After a while, she turned to him. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was steady and her hands were still. "I want to go home," she said. I don't mean Helena." She looked at him with the directness she had arrived at somewhere over the mountains, the quality of attention that did not ask permission or apologize for itself. "I mean home. The cabin. The trial isn't, I know. I'll come back for every day of it." She held his gaze. "But right now, today, I need to stand somewhere that doesn't belong to a court or a marshal's office or a man who thought he could own me. I need to cook something in a kitchen where nobody's watching. I need to sit on a porch and not be afraid of who's coming up the road." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Let's go home." They rode back in 5 days. No mountain passes this time. No hidden routes or calculated detours. They took the main road, stopped at way stations in the daylight, watered the horses without looking over their shoulders, bought provisions from people who had no idea who they were and no reason to care. Ellie rode with her head up. The satchel, empty now, was tied to the saddle. It flapped loose in the breeze, like something that had finished its work and was resting. She did not feel the loss of its weight as emptiness. She felt it as lightness. The difference between those two things was everything. They reached the cabin on a Tuesday evening. The cottonwood on the ridge was catching the last of the light, the leaves going gold at their edges. The fence line ran straight, and the barn stood solid, and the porch faced west the way it always had into the long country that went on past the limit of what you could see. Lucy walked straight to the trough. Ellie's roan followed without being guided. Ellie dismounted. She stood in the yard and looked at the cabin, at the porch, at the chair where Cole had sat for 3 years waiting for nothing. She put her hand on the fence rail, the one Cole had built, the summer Della died post by post, because building was the only thing that kept his hands from shaking, and she ran her fingers along the wood, the way you touch something you have been thinking about from a long distance and want to confirm is real. Cole came up beside her, smaller than I remembered, she said. "Things look different when you're not running, better or worse, just different." She walked to the porch steps, turned and stood at the top, looking down at him where he stood in the yard. The evening light was behind her. The cottonwood was on the ridge. The horses were drinking. Everything was completely still in the way that things are still when they have arrived where they were going. She said, "Cole." He looked up at her. "She said I told you at Fort Ellis that when this was finished, I would tell you something I have never told any man. I'm ready now." He stood at the bottom of the steps. He waited. "I love you," she said. "Not because you carried me off a trail, not because you rode through mountains for me, not because you stood between me and a man with a gun and didn't flinch." She paused. "I love you because you looked at me when I had nothing. When I had no name, I trusted no money, no history that hadn't been contaminated by someone else's version of me. You looked at me in the middle of all of that and decided I was enough. Not fixable, not manageable, not a problem to be solved. Enough. Right then, exactly as I was." Cole's hands were still at his sides. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something steady inside that wanted to move. "Nobody has done that for me," she said. "Not once in 44 years. Not my father who loved me but couldn't protect me. Not Arthur who owned me but never saw me. Not one single person before you." She came down one step. "I'm going to testify," she said. "I'm going to see Arthur convicted, and I'm going to take back what my father built. And then I'm going to come back here and build a life with you. Not because I need you, because I choose you the way Della chose you, with my eyes open and both hands unclenched. Cole looked at her. The evening was going golden behind the hills. His eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them because there was no reason to. "I ain't a rich man," he said. "I had a rich man. He nearly killed me. I'm not educated the way you are. You're the wisest person I have ever known. Education is just books. Wisdom is what you do with the living. I'm a widower with 40 acres and a horse that's too old, and a fence that needs work every spring. Then we'll fix it together." She came down the last step, stood in front of him close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples, the scar on his jaw she had never asked about, and he had never explained. She reached up and put her hand flat against the brown leather vest against his chest. The same place Della had pressed her palm the second winter they were together and said, "That's the one." "I want to ask you something," Ellie said. He covered her hand with his. "I want to ask you to marry me," she said. "Right here, under that tree. I'm done waiting for someone else to decide what happens in my life. I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. One of those silences that contains an entire answer and is simply taking its time arriving at words. "I was going to ask you that," he said. "I know, but I'm asking first." He looked at her, then he said, "Yes. Yes, Ellie, 1,000 times yes." She pressed her forehead against his chest, and he put his arms around her. Not tight, not desperate, just steady with the quiet sureness of a man who has decided to hold something and intends to keep holding it as long as there is anything left of him to hold. And they stood like that in the yard of the cabin as the last evening light went out of the sky and the first stars appeared over the Montana hills one by one until there were too many to count. They married the following Sunday under the cottonwood tree on the ridge. No preacher, no guests, no ceremony borrowed from anyone else's idea of what the occasion should look like. Just two people standing in the shade of a tree that had been growing long before they arrived and would keep growing long after they were gone, saying what they meant to say. Cole wore the blue work shirt and the brown leather vest. He wore Della's ring on a chain around his neck, not on his hand, not locked away in a drawer, but present, carried forward. Because some things you honor by keeping close without pretending the past did not happen and did not matter. Ellie wore a dress May Whitfield had sent from Stillwater, without being asked, addressed simply to the cabin. Blue cotton, white thread at the cuffs. She had written May a letter from Helena, telling her what had happened, and May had written back 2 lines. "You did it, honey. Come home." They stood in the dappled shade and said what they meant. Cole said, "I loved Della with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that was the end of it. That a man only gets one, and I'd had mine, and the rest was just time I had to fill until the dirt covered me." He looked at Ellie. "And then I rode out one July morning and found a woman in the dust who was holding on to a bag of truth so hard she wouldn't let go even when she didn't have the strength to stay conscious. And something that had been finished started again. Not the same thing, something different, but real." He took her hands. "I'm going to be here every morning, every night, in every hard thing, in every easy one. I'm going to build you that extra room. I'm going to fix the fence every spring without complaining about it. And every time you forget who you are, I'm going to remind you. Because you are the bravest person I have ever known, and you earned every inch of the ground you're standing on." Ellie said, "I'm going to love you without holding back and without waiting for permission. I'm going to learn what it feels like to live in a place where nobody owns me and nobody asks me to be smaller than I am. I'm going to burn the bread sometimes and try again. I'm going to find a piano if it takes me 10 years to find one worth having. And every morning I'm going to wake up knowing that I chose this life, that I chose you, and that it was the best decision I ever made with the freedom I fought to have." He kissed her, slow and certain. The kind of kiss that is not the beginning or the end of something, but the deep middle of something already underway with no reason to stop. The cottonwood moved above them in a wind that came off the hills from the west. Small sound, steady. Arthur Voss was convicted the following spring on all charges. He was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. The estate of Amos Britton was fully restored to Eleanor Voss, every cent with interest accumulated over the years. It had been held by order of the court. She did not move back to Boston. She did not need to. Everything that Boston had meant to her was already behind her, and everything worth keeping from it had come west in a leather satchel on the Bozeman Trail. She used the restored estate to build a school in Stillwater. She named it the Amos Britton School and inscribed his name above the door in letters large enough to read from the road. She hired May Whitfield for the Board of Trustees and wrote her the kind of letter that takes 3 careful drafts to get right. She sent Walt Hensley a new whittling knife and a short letter with it. The letter said only, "Thank you for Nora's story. It saved mine. I hope she is well in Oregon. I hope her garden grows." Cole built the extra room that winter. He built it with good timber and a window that faced the valley because Ellie said she wanted to see the country while she worked, and he could not find a reasonable argument against that. He fixed the fence every spring, as he had promised. He noticed over the years that it needed less work each season, which he attributed to better technique. Ellie attributed it to the fact that he was finally paying attention to what needed doing rather than doing the work in order to have something to do. They found the piano in Helena in October, an old upright with honey-colored wood and 3 keys that had gone permanently silent at some earlier point in its life. Cole borrowed a cart and hauled it back over 60 miles of road, which took 2 full days and produced a quantity of language that he preferred not to have witnessed. Ellie rode alongside on the roan for both days, maintaining pace without comment, which was its own complete form of kindness. She played every evening after that. She played with both hands, open fingers moving over the keys without hesitation, filling the cabin with sound that traveled through the open windows and out across the grass and into the last light of every evening. Cole would lean against the door frame with his coffee and close his eyes and listen, and he would think about how strange it was that a man could spend 3 years sitting in the ashes of his life, not quite alive, not quite anything recognizable, and then ride out one July morning into the wrong kind of smoke and come back carrying something that turned out, despite everything, to be the beginning. He did not consider himself a man who had saved anyone. He considered himself a man who had been in the right place at the right moment on the right road and who had done the one thing the moment required, which was to stay. Ellie played on into the evening, the 3 silent keys gone unnoticed in the sound the working ones made together. The music went out through the windows and across the grass and past the fence line and out into the open country that stretched west past everything you could see, carrying in it something that had no name in any language, but that everyone who has ever sat in the dark and listened to someone they love play music has felt in their chest, in the place below, words where the most true things live. Outside, the Montana sky went from gold to copper to the deep, patient dark that belongs only to open country, where there is nothing between you and the stars but your own small, sufficient, hard-won life.